are you, sir?
I am fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me and for asking.
No, look, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, we ran through your deck earlier when we were getting ready for this. There's an awful lot in there. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you get on with it, actually, Tom. I will be back to put any questions you might have to Tom at the end of this, so please do. Usual rules apply. Pop them in the chat, raise your virtual hand, anything you got. Let's bring up Tom's pictures to help him tell his words, and we'll pass it over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Raftery.
Thank you so much. So the first slide here I have is a photo of my dad. I took this picture on his 80th birthday. I'm originally Irish, big Irish family. We had a huge party, hence he's looking so happy. The reason I have a picture of him there is because I work at the intersection of technology and sustainability is one of my big passions, and I credit that to my dad, because when I was a kid growing up in Ireland, he would take me to the countryside most weekends. We'd go walking, we'd be looking at animals, and I developed a deep love of nature. And I went on to have a summer job working in a wildlife park, working with endangered species, and then went to university, studied biology, went on to start a PhD project in biological control, but then got a little bit distracted when I discovered computers and got into that as well. And now I'm fortunate enough to have to be working, as I said, at the nexus of technology and sustainability, my two great passions. So, you know, it's ideal. It's the best place to be when you're working on the things you love. Unfortunately, my dad is not with us anymore. It's not that he has died, it's rather he was diagnosed in 2010 with Alzheimer's, and so while he's still alive, there's not much left of him. But, you know, he has missed, consequently, what's happened in the world with COVID in the last 2 years. So at least that's one upside of it. But what has happened in the world in the last 2 years is we've seen enormous changes. And I'm not talking about COVID, I'm actually talking more about climate, because while there's been a huge number of COVID stories in the news, there's been an enormous amount happening in climate as well, but you might have missed some of those headlines because of the coverage COVID was getting. So, for example, the European Union adopted a climate law in June of this year stating that all 27 nations of the EU have to reduce their emissions 55% against the 1990 baseline by 2030. To put that in some kind of context, we've already reduced our emissions 24% against that baseline, so that gives us 31% to reduce between now and 2030. So in the next 8 years, we've got to reduce our emissions 31%. Now, last year, during lockdown, during the whole of 2020, we reduced our emissions 7%. And of course, we kind of came out of that this year and they went back up 5%. So in the last 2 years, we've reduced our emissions 2%. Now, in the next 8 years, we've got to reduce them 31%. And this is legally binding on all 27 nations. It's enormously ambitious. And to make that happen, we're going to require massive structural changes, the likes of which have not been seen before. It's not just the EU. The Biden administration have said they want to reduce their emissions 52% by 2030. It's a target rather than a legally binding mandate like in Europe, but still it speaks to a direction of travel. And China have said they want to become net zero by 2060 or before 2060. They've also said they want their emissions to peak by 2030. And they've also said that by 2030, they want to source 40% of their electricity from renewable sources. So, you know, again, huge ambitions for the next 8 years and beyond in the three largest global economic blocs, China, the EU, and the US. In fact, in China this year, for the very first time, their non-fossil fuel power capacity has outstripped coal power. And that's historic. So that also speaks to a direction of travel. And it's fantastic to see the announcement coming out of COP26 that China and the US, who are at loggerheads about so many things, are at least united and willing to work together on reducing emissions. And even Saudi Arabia, a country not noted for its, climate kudos, they have said they're going to source 50% of their energy from renewable sources by 2030, and they're planting 10 billion trees. So again, the world is changing. The world is changing enormously. In fact, with all of this, the global economy is about to become the climate economy. Business decisions moving forward will be weighed not just on their financial implications, but also on their climate implications. If we look at some of the other stakeholders involved in this, the courts are getting involved. Climate activists are now starting to take their governments to court to force the governments into action. This has already happened several times here in Europe. This particular story speaks to France. The government of France lost this court case, and they've now been mandated to meet the targets that they set. This also happened earlier this year, both in the Netherlands and in Germany. So this is speaking to a trend as well of the courts starting to get involved in this. The US Treasury has said that the development banks can no longer finance fossil fuel projects. And it's not just the US Treasury who said that. China announced recently as well that they are no longer going to finance coal projects, which is something they had been doing for the last number of decades, financing coal projects outside of China in order to increase their global influence. Well, now they've announced they've stopped doing that. They're not going to do that anymore. And the financial community is getting heavily involved in this as well. And, for reasons of risk more than anything else, there's this concept called the carbon budget. And the carbon budget concept says that we have decided as a planet in 2015, 197 countries signed up to keeping our emissions at 1.5 degrees C, or worst case scenario, 2 degrees C. So now that we have the limits set that we know we're going to stop at, we can figure out how much carbon it takes to get us to either 1.5 or 2 degrees C. So that amount of carbon is actually known. We know how much carbon it takes to get us to those limits. And so working back from that, we know how much is there. We also happen to know what the fossil fuel reserves, proven reserves, are of the fossil fuel companies and countries. And the big problem there is that the proven reserves, which is, what the value of these companies is based on, the big problem is that the fossil fuel reserves are 3 times the amount that we can emit before we get to 2 degrees C. So that means there's a huge carbon bubble. There's going to be enormous stranded assets. The fossil fuel companies are going to have to write off 2/3 of their value. And as a consequence of that and the fear of investing and losing money, the financial markets are now starting to price that risk in. The cost of capital now for fossil fuels is increasing. If you see on this chart here, offshore oil, the cost of capital for offshore oil projects is now over 20%. For gas projects, it's well over 10%. And for renewables, it's under 5%. And that speaks to another direction of travel that's going to keep going. Those projects are going to get more and more expensive for fossil fuel and cheaper for renewable. And we saw a great announcement come out of COP26, an organization called GFANZ. GFANZ stands for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And that is an organization of 450 financial institutions who together manage a total of $130 trillion. And they have committed to putting that $130 trillion only towards net zero projects that will not fund emissions. And that amount of money can make an enormous change. And the other kind of stakeholders you can think about are employees in companies. If you are trying to attract and keep employees, if you have a good sustainability story to tell, you'll find it far easier to recruit and keep good employees. Similarly, on the other side, customers. If you're trying to sell, if you have a very good sustainability story to tell, you'll find it far easier to get and keep good customers. So, this is win, win, win all around. If we look at something like the energy space, which is responsible for a lot of our global emissions today, Sheikh Yamani, who some of you might remember, was the OPEC oil minister in the 1980s. And he famously said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And similarly, the oil age will end long before we run out of oil. And he's been proven right, because we've already hit peak oil. And we didn't do it for reasons of, sustainability. We've done it for economic reasons. The cost of solar has dropped 90% in the last 10 years. And the cost of wind has dropped about 60% in the same time. So it's now cheaper. And this is an historic moment in the energy space. It is now cheaper to build net new from greenfield renewables than it is to fund or keep going fuel existing fossil fuel plants. Just buying the fuel for fossil fuel plants is more expensive than building out net new renewable plants. It's incredible. You can see it here on this chart. China, India, and Germany, it's all there. It's all cheaper. And the cost of fossil fuels is only going up. The cost of renewables is only going down. So that trend is going to keep going that way as well. And you can see in the first 3 months of this year, the new generation brought online, new power capacity in the United States, you had 2,921 megawatts of wind, 1,690 of solar, 9 of natural gas, and then 5 of hydro. So again, a big direction of travel. And it's not just the generation, it's also the storage. The cost of storage has fallen enormously. Again, it's fallen about an average of 15% year on year over the last 11 years, and that will continue. These kind of drops in price are down to improving technology, economies of scale, and the experience curve. And it's not just that these lithium-ion batteries are getting cheaper, they're also increasing in their energy density. They're increasing energy density of about 5 to 8% per year. And so since 2010, they've tripled in their energy density. They can hold 3 times as much power, and they cost 1/10 of what they did, which leads to charts like this. This is the expected market just for stationary storage for grids out for the next 8 years. And you can see, I always hesitate to use the word explode when I'm talking about batteries, but you can see the battery market is set to completely explode in the next 8 years. And as a consequence, we see things like this. NextEra, who are one of the largest energy retailers in the US, have now said that the combination of renewables plus battery storage beats coal, gas, and nukes in terms of energy production. And we see enormous projects now being built off the back of this. The Sun Cable project in Northern Australia. This is a project where they're building 20 gigawatts of solar. And for context, a gigawatt is roughly the output of a nuclear power plant. 20 nuclear power plants worth of solar with battery storage of, and they haven't finalized the figure yet, but it's between 36 and 42 gigawatt hours of battery storage. And they're going to use this to power the city of Darwin, but they're also going to draw a 3,500 kilometer cable north to power the city of Singapore, which is currently powered about 95% by oil and gas. 3,500 kilometers. The reason Indonesia is mentioned in the title of this slide is because this story mentions that Indonesia have now given approval for that cable to run around in Indonesia to get from Northern Australia up to Singapore. So Enel have brought their targets for net zero. They had targets of net zero by 2050. They've brought it forward to 2040. So a lot of this is happening with energy companies as well. Kazakhstan, they're going to build, I mean, you thought 20 was a large power plant. They're building a 45 gigawatt combined wind and solar park in Kazakhstan. And there'll be no battery storage there. They're going to use it entirely to produce green hydrogen for export. There's another one being built in India, a big solar and wind park in India, where it's going to be 35 gigawatts. So these kind of scale of projects are now only possible because the cost of wind and solar is so low. So they are eminently scalable. And if we flip it around and look at fossil fuels and some of the things they cause, we saw just last week the city of Delhi went into lockdown. And we're used to hearing about lockdowns in the last couple of years with COVID. But no, this lockdown wasn't because of COVID. It was because of pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. There are 11 coal-fired power plants around Delhi. They all had to be shut down. All transportation was shut down. All schools and colleges closed. Now, some of the pollution in Delhi happens annually because of the burning of stubble by farmers around the city as well. But the vast majority is from fossil fuels. And a figure that absolutely astounded me when I came across it is the number of people who die every year from fossil fuel pollution is 8.7 million. 8.7 million die every single year from the burning of fossil fuels. And if you put that in context beside COVID, COVID has killed about 7 million, 7 million people in total. This is 8.7 million people a year. So we really, really need to transition, if not for climate, just for our own public health. Transportation, the transportation space is being heavily upended as well by this. So I moved here to Spain in 2008, and because of my, passion for sustainability, my filter for buying a car at the time was lowest emissions. And at the time, 2008, the lowest emissions was a Toyota Prius. So I got that car, kept it for 10 years. And then in 2018, I switched to a full EV. I got a Nissan Leaf. Now, the Nissan Leaf is a bit of a compromise. It's a fine car, but it has a range of about 250 kilometers. So what's that, about 150 miles on a good day with a strong tailwind, going downhill a lot of the way. And more recently, I got that in 2018. It was at the time the Model 3 hadn't made it to Europe, so it was the best medium-size EV, full EV available in Europe. But earlier this year, I switched to a Volkswagen ID.4, and you can see that gets a range of about 500 kilometers, depending on how you drive it. If you're on the motorway doing 70 miles an hour, for example, 80 miles an hour, then that drops down to about 350, 370 kilometers. But, just driving around town, you get over 500 kilometers, no problem at all. It's an amazing car. And it speaks to a change as well in the technologies. Again, the batteries becoming cheaper and more energy dense means that the car that was available, best car available in 2018 at 250 kilometers, by 2021, it was 500 kilometers. So, things are changing. Norway, the country of Norway, is streets ahead of everybody else in this. They've set a mandate of shutting down sales of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2025. But based on their sales figures, they're going to get there long before that. They're going to get there by as early as April of next year. That's what it's looking like right now. And Western Europe, here in Western Europe, we are now at about 16% of new vehicle sales are fully electric. That's up from 2.5% in 2019. It's up from 6.7% in 2020. It's now at 16. So that's on a real, S curve right there. And we shouldn't just be talking about public transportation. I love this quote from Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, where he says, "A developed country is not a place where poor people have cars. It's where rich use public transportation." And to that end, the electric bus fleet, the London one is now the largest in Europe. Globally, the amount of fully electric buses is well over 600,000 now. Over 500,000 of those are in China. Fully electric buses now account for nearly 40% of new bus sales. Taxis are going fully electric as well because, for reasons of economics, electric vehicles are far cheaper to own and maintain. So Addison Lee, who are the largest taxi firm in London, have put in an order for 4,000 Volkswagen ID.4s, for example, and they're going to roll them out next year. Deliveries, trucks are now going electric as well. DB Schenker, who are one of the largest logistics companies in the world, have put in an order for 1,500 Volta Zeros, and Amazon put in an order for 100,000 electric Rivians, electric delivery vehicles. So that'll make a huge change to the emissions coming from local deliveries as more of us are buying from home. Larger trucks as well, Volkswagen, all the big truck manufacturers are rolling out fully electric trucks. Volvo have these 3 on sale today, for example. And then if we look at shipping, the ferries are getting into batteries as well. And Maersk are looking at getting green methanol for for fueling their large container ships. So even the shipping industry is looking at going away from fossil fuels as well. If we look at other sectors, the cement sector, for example, enormous emissions from there. I run a podcast called the Climate 21 podcast, and I had a guy on it called, a number of months ago, I had a guy on it called Professor Volker Sick, and he was talking about this story here, where they've come up with a way of using CO2 as an ingredient in making concrete. And so the resultant concrete is actually more flexible than standard concrete, which means you don't need to put in as much steel rebar, which is a complete win-win, because if you reduce the CO2 required to create the concrete, and you've also reduced the steel content of it, and steel itself has a huge carbon footprint. And in Germany and other countries, they're starting to spend billions now on cleaning up steel production using the likes of green hydrogen, the likes of the hydrogen that they're producing in Kazakhstan, to produce fossil fuel-free steel. It's always difficult to say fossil fuel-free steel. I'll get there. And ArcelorMittal are turning 2 of their plants into using green hydrogen for producing steel. And Volvo are the first car maker to explore using fossil fuel-free steel, sourcing theirs from a company called SSAB, who delivered the first fossil fuel-free steel to Volvo earlier this year. And let's see, I think the clicker has stopped. No, it's working again. Good. Okay. So the aviation industry is a really, really, really tough one to decarbonize. United Airlines earlier this year bought 100 fully electric planes from a company called Heart Aviation, but that's 19-seater smaller planes. Those ones are not that hard, but the longer, the transatlantic ones are going to be really hard to decarbonize. Airbus has revealed their blended wing version. I suspect that long term, unless there's a huge breakthrough in battery technology, longer term, the larger planes will go with sustainable aviation fuel. What kind of actions can you or should you be taking as an organization? Well, the first, most basic, most fundamental one is to set emissions reduction targets, measure your emissions, and report transparently against those targets. Convert everything to electric. Convert your transport, your heating, your cooking, your aircon, everything that you can, convert it to electric, and then source all of your energy from renewables. Become more circular. Use circular economy technologies that'll get your emissions down and reduce your waste. Require emissions reporting in all your RFPs and RFQs. Require your suppliers to report the emissions associated with getting their products. Set an internal carbon price for any project that you're doing in your organization. And finally, and this one is usually the one that causes the most discomfort, but it is the one that I think has the most possibility of moving the needle. It's tie executive remuneration to emissions reduction KPIs. Right there. That's a huge one. Last thoughts. We've said the 2020s are going to be the decade of action, and they are, because that target of getting 55% out of our system by 2030 is going to be incredibly hard to meet. But if it is, then the 2030s are going to have to be the decade of way more action, because that 55% that we get out is going to be the low-hanging fruit. So the 2030s is going to be the decade of way, way more action, and the 2040s are going to be the decade of, oh, that's a lot of action, because we have to get to net zero by 2050. I came across this quote by climate professor Kevin Anderson, where he said, "We face an unavoidably radical future. We either continue with rising emissions and reap the radical repercussions of severe climate change, or we acknowledge that we have a choice and we pursue radical emissions reductions. Either way, there is no longer a non-radical option." Now is the time, folks. If you're not already doing it, now is the time to move. We all need to step up and become climate heroes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Fantastic stuff. It reminds me a lot of the, I think it's a Bill Gates quote about technology, where he says, less happens in a year than you think, but a lot more happens over 10 years that you think.
Yeah, it's true. And I love that quote as well. And it does, you always underestimate what will potentially happen in 10 years. I mean, the world has changed enormously in the last 10 years. 2010 was when, was it 2010 or 2011 that the first tablet, the iPad, was introduced. And see now how, you know, they're everywhere in organizations. You see people out in the field, service technicians using them all the time, whereas previously it was clipboards and pens. No longer do you see those. You know, technology has completely overwhelmed us, and, you know, thankfully so, because the more we digitize everything, we can then thus measure everything, because that's what we need to do. We need to measure all our emissions and report against them, as I said in the first point, and those actions that I suggested for people.
And in terms, actually, the lovely segue, in fact, so I did want to ask about those actions. What does that look like in really practical, and I'm sorry to be horribly pragmatic, but in really practical terms? You know, you talked about you need to get these into your RFPs, get this into your RFQs. Is there a job title or a job role that needs to be created here? Because I'm guessing that often people think they're doing the best, but it's simply, you know, it's muscle memory. I don't look the right way. I'm not asking the right questions. So do you think there is a new role that needs to be created?
I mean, lots of organizations already have a chief sustainability officer, for example. And that's probably the person that should be leading this charge, but they need to hook up with their data scientists in the organization. And because there's a whole raft of legislation coming down the pike to help us meet those targets, what you're going to start to see is that measuring and reporting mandated. And so what you have today very often is you have the chief sustainability officer reporting into the CMO, the chief marketing officer, and that's the wrong place for them to be, because the mandating of the emissions reporting that's coming will require those reports to be auditable. And so you'll start to see the chief sustainability officer shift from the CMO organization into the CFO organization, because it will be required that the reporting be reported with the same rigor that financial reports are published today.
So you're saying that, just to be kind of clear on that actually it's table stakes. It's moving away from being something that is PR. This is now table stakes.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a legislation passed in Europe where now by, I think it's 2024, so 2 years from now, companies with more than, I think, and I might have the numbers wrong here, but it's the right order of magnitude. Companies with about 100 employees or more than 10 million euros in revenue have to report emissions from 2024 onwards.
Yeah, fantastic. We do have a question from our audience. That's James, I think, from the Alberta Energy Regulator. Good morning, James. How are you, sir? And what is your question for Tom?
I'm good, thank you. So for Tom, how you presented that was really, really good in terms of the data, how you tell the story. If you think of trying to really drive change, it feels at the moment, I just have a Canadian perspective, so I may be wrong as I ask this question, that there needs to be a standard around when we report climate numbers, really what are those numbers? So within Canada, the numbers that are reported at the moment are calculated amounts rather than the value at source. If we're really trying to drive change, it feels we need to be reporting at source so we know exactly which piece of equipment in the field needs to be upgraded to reduce the methane emissions, as an example. So do you feel there needs to be a very prescriptive standard around climate reporting to actually drive the change at source?
Absolutely, James, I do. And there's I have to apologize now because I've forgotten the name of it, but there is a new standard that has come out in the last couple of months. I think it's the net zero standard for oil and gas. I think that's what it's called. Feel free to drop me an email after this and I'll find the report for you and send it to you. But it's a standard that has been put out into the market by a large group of financial investors, including, for example, the Church of England. And this group of investors together, they command trillions of dollars, not 130 trillion like the GFANs, and they've managed to get 6 of the largest oil and gas companies to sign up to say they will report to this standard. So that will make their reports at least cross-comparable. And I think that will help drive others into the same situation. And the issue that you pointed out as well about methane emissions, that's one that is hugely important as well. And I think that will in part be helped by some of the newer Earth observatory kind of satellite imaging that's being done, because a lot of that is now looking for methane from space, finding sources of emissions. They've already pinpointed a place in Australia, I think it was, I read earlier this week, where there's far more methane emissions coming from a particular coal mine than is actually being reported. So, and that's just been found by satellite imagery, so, and that will start to be more and more common as we launch more and more satellites to monitor what's going on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Someone has just posted in the chat, James, and it is, Tom, it is the net zero standard for oil and gas as of September 2021. So you did get it right.
Perfect.